So this is the cranium. Right over here in the front, you have what we call the frontal bone, just like the name says. On the back, you have two parietal bones, one on each side. Here on the back, we have what we call the occipital bone. And on this side, you have the temporal bone on one side and the temporal bone on the other side. So summarizing, you have one frontal bone, one occipital bone, two parietal bones, and two temporal bones. Now if we focus on the frontal bone, you're going to see that the frontal bone has two holes on top of the orbit. So these two holes, if it's a hole, it's called foramen, and because they're on top, they're called supra. So you're going to have a supra-orbital foramen on each side. The other bone that we should focus on is the nasal bone. You have two nasal bones right over here. Then on the inside, you have what we call the lacrimal bone. So you have a lacrimal bone on this side and a lacrimal bone on the other side. The other major bone that you have is what we call the maxilla. It's a huge bone here in the front. And the maxilla is the bone that's going to have the upper teeth inserted on. The other thing that you should be focusing on these holes over here on the maxilla. And because you have a supraorbital foramen, that means you're also going to have an infraorbital foramen. And so the infraorbital foramen means that it's a hole on the bottom of the orbit. And this infraorbital foramen is located on the maxilla. The other major bone that we have is what we call the mandible. Now the mandible will have a couple of paired holes too. And right over here you can see a pair right over here. These are called your mental foramen. Now remember, if you can visualize, when you're thinking, you put your hand on your chin. So that means mental thinking. So that's how you're going to remember that these are your mental foramen. The other hole that we have on the mandible are these two holes over here. So you have one on this side and one on the other side. And because they're holes on the mandible, they're called mandibular foramen. Since I have you in this position too, you can see the maxilla over here. So this is the bottom part of the maxilla that forms the roof of the mouth. And posterior to it, you're going to have your palatine bone. So there's a line over here that separates the maxilla from the palatine bone. On the mandible, the last thing that you need to know is the smooth structure here. So if we're talking about smooth, means condyle. Always remember, smooth condyle. So because it's on the mandible is your mandibular condyle. And the mandibular condyle is going to articulate with the mandibular fossa that's on your temporal bone. But the temporal bone, we're going to talk about it on a different station. Okay, but just remember that the mandibular condyle that's located in the mandible will articulate with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. The last bone that we need to know on this station is your occipital bone. Now the occipital bone is going to have a few features that you need to know. It has the big hole over here, that's the foramen magnum that your spinal cord is going to pass through. Now see how you have these smooth surfaces over here. Remember, smooth means condyle. So this will be your occipital condyle because it's your occipital bone. Underneath the occipital condyle, you have what's called the hypoglossal canal. Now hypoglossal canal means that it's going to be going to your tongue. So if it's going to your tongue, it needs to run in this direction, right? Because this is where your tongue is going to be located. So remember that the hypoglossal canal is going to pass underneath your occipital condyle. The last hole that you need to know is this big hole over here, which is your hypoglossal canal. Now, what's going to pass through this is going to be your, not hypoglossal canal, your jugular foramen. So your jugular foramen is going to contain your jugular vein, which means that it's going to be draining the blood from your brain. So it needs to be a hole that goes up and down, different from the hypoglossal canal that goes in this direction here. And the last things that you need to know are the sutures. So right over here, the one that runs sagittal is your sagittal suture, which separates your parietal bones. This one would be your coronal suture that separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones. And remember how the coronal suture forms like a C. That's how you will remember. Back here, the lambdoidal suture separates the occipital bone from the parietal bones, and it sort of has this lambdoidal shape right over here. And the squamous suture will separate the parietal bone from the temporal bone.